Erev Tov and welcome, everyone. Just a number of weeks ago, my wife and daughter and I went to Israel. And one of our favorite things in Yerushalayim was to go to this outdoor market called Shuk, which means market, Machane Yehuda. And one of the fun things about it is not everything, but almost every stall is kosher. And they have the signs that tell you they're kosher. So one of the greatest things is quite literally like being a kid in a candy store. They have all of these stalls that have lots of candy. And you would think it's the greatest thing, especially really for my daughter, not for me, but you can just buy all the candy you want, except it's not so simple. You don't just buy any candy because just because it says it's kosher, there's different levels of kashrut in Israel. And if you're getting a piece of fruit, not a big deal, but candy, we're really strict on it. Why? Why are we losing our mind and have to use the highest level of kashrut in Yerushalayim for buying gummy bears? That is the question we'll answer tonight. Why is it that Jell-O, an extremely popular snack, which has the letter K, which, by the way, unless it's Kellogg's, any product that has a K on it means absolutely nothing. Any company can put it on there. It could be bacon strips, and they could put a K on it. I don't know why they would. That would really be false advertising. But why is Jell-O problematic? And it all comes down to one chemical product called gelatin, which I believe is the reason that Jell-O is called what it is. I could be wrong about that, but I think back in the day, there used to be, whether it was Jell-O or a similar snack, it was called gelatin snacks. And it was Jell-O, but it was called gelatin. So what is gelatin, and why is it such a problem that we can't just go to any candy store in Yerushalayim, why we can't have so many snacks and gummy bears and other products, why even medicine capsules can be problematic. So what is gelatin? The simplest explanation of gelatin is this. It takes animal skin and bones, and I'm being very specific there. It's not the meat of an animal. It is their skin and bones, and it is processed. I don't know the exact chemical process. I actually looked at the chemical, like the letters and everything and all the chemical bonds and stuff illustrated and just right over my head. But it is with liquid turned into a completely new substance, and that substance can be used in so many products. The common one we're talking about is food, and that's important because that's the only time it's an issue. It's used in cosmetics, it's used in moisturizers, it could be used in other products I'm not familiar with, but if you're going to use gelatin from, let's say, pig bones to make makeup, that's fine. The Torah has no problem with that. Making moisturizer out of, zebra feet, weird, but again, that's not a problem. Our problem is eating it, because as we all know, I didn't even bring the verse here, I don't want to take it for granted, but eating pork and unkosher animals, eating their meat is forbidden from the Torah. And the first source that we'll look at here, and I'll just read this very first one from the Talmud, says, I'll just even read the Hebrew, Shehayotze min hatameh tameh, veyotze min hatahor tahor. If you take something from an impure, i.e. non-kosher animal, i.e. you take its bone, its skin, anything, and not its actual meat, you take anything from it, it starts with it, it's still unkosher. And if you take something from a kosher animal, it's kosher. So if this was the only source we had tonight, we could end the class here. Anything that's taken from pigs, whether it's their skin, their bones, pig is unkosher, therefore that stuff is unkosher. Again, we're only talking about eating, so I don't care about moisturizer, skincare, other products like that, only stuff that I actually eat. And by the way, as we'll see in some of the sources, just because it's a kosher animal like a cow, it still has to be slaughtered properly. So again, we'll come back to that. But if it's an unkosher animal, which most gelatin products on the market are taken from either unkosher animals, pigs, one of the most common, or cows, which are not slaughtered according to Jewish law. So end of story. Anything with gelatin is completely unkosher, right? Right? We'll see. So the question we're going to explore tonight is, why are there debates around whether or not gelatin might be kosher? Why is there differing practice in Israel to where there's places that say they are kosher and have gummy bears and gummy worms that have gelatin from animals that may or may not be kosher animals that are considered kosher, and then places that disagree with it in Israel? What's going on here? So what we're going to do tonight is look at all of the main sources that every rabbi for the past 200 years looked at these main sources, and then based on these sources, they ruled one way or the other. So we'll look at the core sources, make sure we understand them so we can rule for ourselves. And then at the end, there's a very short article in English that kind of summarizes the different rabbinic opinions to understand, where we stand in the Jewish world. So the first place to go with is we started with the assumption on source number one that if it's pig bones or pig skin, which I know that's kind of icky, but that's what gelatin is. So you just choose to not eat gelatin if it's too icky. It's not kosher, right? Well, Lindsay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And the first source here, it's not just the source, but how it's understood by the rabbis is from the Torah. So from Vayikra, and we're going to focus on one word. Actually, in English, the first three words, but please, source number one in section B, which is called no bones about it, as you'll see why in a moment.
From their flesh you are not to eat, their carcasses you are not to touch. They are tamei for you.
Excellent. So it says in the Hebrew, mibsaram, from their flesh, from their meat, don't eat it. And we'll come back to that next word, carcasses. There's different reasons an animal can be unkosher. One is it could just be an animal that's forbidden by the Torah, whether it's a lobster or a pig. Two, it's an animal that was just found dead, i.e. it died, even of natural causes. And the reason that's not kosher, even if it's a cow, is for Jews, any animal that they eat has to be, or at least any mammal, has to be slaughtered in a kosher way, because fish you don't have to slaughter. But we're talking here about mammals that are used to make gelatin. And the third one we'll talk about later is an animal that is slaughtered in the kosher way, but when they open it up, they find out that it has injuries and other kinds of sicknesses that make it not kosher. But our focus here will come up, and I'll have you, Lindsay, read source number two. This is a midrashic source, and there's two kinds of midrashim. One that are more story and legend-based that help explain a story or add layers to a character, and some of them that have legal explanations that, again, are not actually in the Torah, but are derived and based and influenced by it. So source number two, please.
Of their flesh you may not eat, but not of their bones or sinews or hooves, i.e. you may eat those.
So the Midrash, which is a foundational source, says when the Torah says you cannot eat unkosher animals, it focuses on the word basar, their meat. So you can't eat the meat of unkosher animals. And this halachic legalistic Midrash says the Torah only talks about their meat, meaning that by focusing on that word meat, it's not including everything that you make gelatin from. So if you go up to a pig, and according to this understanding of the Torah, you could eat pig feet. Don't, and you'll see why in a second that we certainly don't do that. But technically speaking, all the Torah, according to this Midrash, is concerned about is their actual meat. And part of that is, that's the only part that's really eaten of an animal. There are certainly cultures that do eat, and in fact, there is a Jewish delicacy called pacha, which I have not had, and it's made of cow feet, which is a kosher slaughtered cow and everything like that. But generally, people don't eat these parts, use it for other things. But strictly speaking, these things are not included in the Torah prohibition. Their skin, their sinews, their gidim, their all their hooves, etc., like that. So again, if we ended right here, we would say that gelatin is fine because it's made of the parts that are not forbidden by the Torah. And by the way, in some ways, the conversation could end here because everyone is going to agree that these parts of the animal are not forbidden to be eaten by the Torah. And again, if you want to use any of these parts to make clothing or a toy or an object, nobody's going to argue with that other than tefillin. You can't do that with this unkosher stuff. But in terms of eating, the Torah doesn't have a problem with it, but the rabbis do. So, Lindsay, I'll have you do one more because those were so short. So this is Rambam's Mishnah Torah, and in it, he's going to clarify what I just said, but add a very important addendum, which will guide us through the rest of the class. So please go ahead, Lindsay.
When a person eats the skin, the bones, the sinews, the horns, or the hoofs of a
nevela or treifa. So nevela, again, is an animal that just died. It wasn't slaughtered at all. It was a kosher animal, but it just died. A treifa is one that was slaughtered, shechted in a kosher way, but when it was opened up, it had some kind of imperfection or disease or injury. And according to Jewish law, you can only eat or sacrifice an animal if its insides and outsides are totally perfect. That's where you get like the term glat from, is you look at the lungs, and if they're smooth, they have no growths or cancerous growths or whatever. If it's smooth, glat, then it's kosher. So that's the origin of glat meat, meaning it was slaughtered and they found nothing inside that was a problem. Please, or a non-kosher.
Or a non-kosher domesticated animal or wild beast, from the nails of a non-kosher fowl in the places where blood would spurt through when they are cut off, or from their placenta. Although this is forbidden, he is not liable. The rationale is that they are not fit to be eaten. They cannot be combined with meat in the measure of an olive-sized portion.
Excellent. So the last thing here again emphasizes, or at least the translator emphasized what I said before. The reason these parts of the animals are outside of the Torah's prohibition is the Torah was giving you a law about what you can eat. These parts of the animal are typically not eaten. And historically, they probably weren't, like the idea of this pacha, this cow feet, or pig's feet, or anything like that. Again, maybe they ate it thousands of years ago. I'm not an expert in it. Could probably easily look it up. But generally, these are not the parts that are eaten. So they're not considered food. And a lot of this class, even though I didn't bring all the sources, is relevant to Pesach. And, for example, Play-Doh. Play-Doh is made from flour. Flour is used in food. But why can you play with Play-Doh on Pesach, even though it's made with flour, which would usually be chametz? Because it's not food. It's left the category of food, and the laws of Pesach and chametz are only concerned with food. Here he says the laws of the Torah and eating are only concerned with food. But he adds a very important point. So you're not breaking a Torah law if you eat any of these, but the rabbis forbade it anyways. Now, the reasons for that, there could be many of them. We'd have to dig a little bit deeper. One is because people might be concerned that it looks like you are eating, like if you're eating pig feet and say, well, the Torah is not against it, still looks like you're eating a part of the pig. Maybe some of its meat is actually inside of it. There's lots of reasons that I personally would also rule this way, that we probably shouldn't be eating pig feet. But that's a very important distinction. Strictly speaking, these parts of the animal that are used to make gelatin, no matter what animal they're from, are not forbidden by the Torah. They are forbidden by the rabbis, which doesn't mean nothing, but it already is in a lower category than the Torah prohibition. So if we ended here, we'd say, oh, gelatin, we're not allowed to eat gelatin, but not because of the Torah, but because of a rabbinic enactment. But again, if we ended here, we'd be right back where we started, which is no go on gelatin. No gelatin snacks, no gummies, but still begs the question, what do we do about gelatin medicine or capsules made from gelatin, or the fact that in Israel, they permit certain gummy bears, say they're kosher, that have gelatin? And that's going to lead us to the next part of the class. But before we go on, are there any questions up until now? And Lindsay, thank you for reading so much. Excellent. So Tamar, I'm going to unmute you for this next question. So well, actually, before we get into some of the theories for permitting some of this, the next source here is one that should help us in most cases, but doesn't. So if we end with the fact that gelatin is not forbidden by the Torah, but it is forbidden, you're not allowed to eat gelatin, the reality is that the amount of gelatin that's used in these snacks and these jellos or whatever it is, it's really tiny and insignificant. And there's a very important Jewish principle. If I am in my kitchen making a big meat cholent and I accidentally, grab the wrong spice thing off the shelf and I pour in, and I think it's salt, but it's actually the Trader Joe's ranch, seasoning or something like that, and a tiny bit, literally less than 1/60th, that's the number, like a tiny little morsel of it to the massive thing, and it's accidental. Ideally, I should scoop it out. If I can't, I don't have to throw out the food. I don't have to throw out my pot. It becomes subsumed. The Hebrew word is batel. It becomes nullified in it. Well, gelatin is so insignificant. It barely makes a difference in terms of the amount of it. So why is it a problem? Fine, it's unkosher. But if a tiny sliver of pig feet falls into my kosher stew, I can still eat it. So why is that a problem here? So tomorrow I'll have you take more than just this, but the short source from the Shulchan Aruch takes away that leniency in this case. So please go ahead, Tamar.
Because something that is forbidden in itself and it gives form, even by 1,000 times the amount, it cannot be nullified.
Excellent. So there's two very important things here why gelatin is a no-go. One, the law about it being nullified if I accidentally spill it, that only works because I did it accidentally. Gelatin is put in quite intentionally. The other thing here is I don't want that tiny little bit of ranch. I mean, maybe I've never had it before. Maybe ranch would make my meat stew taste better, but I certainly don't want it there, and it's certainly not an essential ingredient. But the reason that gelatin is ever added to food, it's usually not flavor, but it's to give it form. It's what gives Jell-O that, and gummy bears. Gummy bears that don't have gelatin, which are the only ones that I eat, and there's a company that just started making kosher jelly bean or kosher gummy bears, not jelly bears, kosher gummy bears. They taste great, but it has the worst texture ever. They're like a solid chunk. But real gummy bears have this amazing texture to them. You cannot get that without some form of gelatin. And there are kosher gelatins. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But gelatin is an essential ingredient. And there's a word here in the Hebrew, ma'amid, which causes it to stand, but essentially it helps form it. It gives it structure, it gives it substance. And because it's essential to it, it has to be there. It wouldn't be the same without it. You can't pretend like it's not there. It doesn't matter if it's 1/1,000,000th of it. You put it in there because you need it for its identity, for it to be a gummy, for it to be Jell-O. So it's not accidental, and it's an essential, even though it doesn't give to the taste, it gives to the formation of it. And this also specifically applies with cheeses. There's a way to make cheese with something called rennet, which is made from the cow, and they put that in there intentionally to help form the cheese. So even though it's a small part, it's essential to making cheese. Now you can make cheese with vegetarian rennet, but again, if the ingredient is essential, you can't nullify it. So as I keep saying all along, again, if we ended here, we don't have any help. But now we're going to start getting some help. So Tamar, now we're going all the way back to the Talmud. That goes on to 2 pages. And the rabbis of the Talmud, actually the rabbis who permit gelatin, turn to a couple different ideas. We're going to look at those ideas and then how they're applied. So this first one is the Talmud, and the way it's being used here has nothing to do with food. It actually has to do with a sandal that walked on something impure. So it's become a tameh sandal. And the question is, if you remove parts of that sandal, let's say there's 2 parts of a sandal, there's the foot part and the tongs. I don't know how they made them back in the day, but you take the straps out, you put in new straps, then you take the bottom out and you put in a new bottom. So it's completely different sandal. You just replaced it one part at a time. Does it become a brand new thing? So go ahead, Tamar, source number 1 from Talmud Bavli and something new.
And then you said to us, with regard to this, that the reason it is no longer a utensil is because a new entity has arrived here. The legal status of the sandal with the 2 repaired ears is not that of the original sandal. It is a new sandal. Here too, with regard to the utensil that was perforated several times, where the sum of all the holes added up to the size of a pomegranate. Let us say that a new entity has arrived here, and the entire area of the hole is completely new, and the utensils is no longer the same utensil that had been ritually impure.
Excellent. So the Hebrew phrase is panim chadashot, new faces or a new entity, which is also relevant after a couple gets married and they do the celebrations where there's 7 blessings, Sheva brachot. Each night that they do it, because they do it for 7 nights after the wedding, there's a custom to make sure there's always new people to celebrate with. And you need panim chadashot. There has to be something new that wasn't there before. So if you replace all parts of the sandal, you could say it's no longer the original sandal. But this last part of it is more important, which is the idea that if you change something so significantly, it says you put all these holes in it that are the size of a rimon, a pomegranate that's so big. It's actually the commentary, it's not in the original text. But if you make it so different, it's as if it's a brand new thing that was never there before. And the way that others apply this is to say that if you start with, pig feet, which is, again, according to the Torah, it's not food, so it's not forbidden to eat, but rabbinically, we don't eat it, but you put it through such an intensive chemical process where the chemical bonds are no longer the same. Yes, it has some similarities, otherwise why even start with pig feet? But it's been so fundamentally changed, 90% changed, whatever it is like that. It's not pig feet anymore. It's a brand new chemical thing. It was just easier to start with pig feet. So many rabbis rely on that principle. And the reason I'm moving on after this section is there are many rabbis who permit gelatin simply with this basis. Like, this is it. This is their argument. And there are those certainly who argue against it, and we'll see some of those ideas. But for many, this is enough. Gelatin is a brand new thing that was never in this world before. And I sort of mentioned one of the arguments against it. If it's truly a fundamentally different thing, why did you need to start with pig feet? Why couldn't you create it from something else? Obviously, there's something about animal skin or animal feet that is essential to what gelatin becomes. So that's kind of the counter argument. But again, this idea that something can lose its impurity, and that's what we care about. That's what kashrut is about, the impurity of it. If you can lose it by changing, by putting holes in it, then by chemically burning it down, melting it, and changing it, why is that not enough to say it's no longer an unkosher item? And again, many will say that. Any questions on that before we move on? Beautiful. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So this next section here is also really important, and I sort of mentioned it when it comes to, hello Jane, welcome, when it comes to Pesach. But this is a really interesting ruling and insanely relevant to our class tonight, because it starts with this phrase, the skin of the stomach, or a keva. It starts with something which is super duper unkosher. So go ahead, and it could be it's probably the the stomach of a cow, and they're adding milk into it. And that's insanely forbidden by the Torah, milk and meat. But go ahead, please, Gloria. And I can make it a little bit bigger. There you go.
The skin of the stomach, sometimes they salt it and dry it out, and it becomes like wood, and they fill it with milk. In this case, the milk is permitted, since after it was dried out, it is like mere wood, and it has no moisture of the meat in it.
Excellent. So one of the things that the rabbis talk a lot about in the Tshuvot, even though we're not going to read the fullness of them, is that the thing about meat, the essence of the meat that makes it, treif, is the liquid in it. Like that's what passes on the unkosher of it. But if you get rid of all of that liquid or all of that blood, whatever it is, then the unkashrutness of it, the treifness of it, I'll just say the treifness of it disappears. So if you take a part of the animal, which is not typically eaten, and you dry it out so much, and they literally say ke'etz, and it becomes like wood, it's no longer considered that unkosher food. It's not considered food anymore. And that's, again, what I mentioned with Play-Doh. When you turn something, flour into, a toy, and it's not edible anymore, it's no longer considered food, and therefore it can't be chametz on Pesach. Here, too, the stomach has been dried out. Any of the treify meat juice is totally gone. And now you could put milk in it, and then you could eat it. It's fine because it's not food. The same way that I don't know why you would do this, but if you take a piece of paper, I don't know why you would do that, but if you take a piece of paper, you could eat it because it's not food. I don't know why you would, but you can eat paper because it's not food. And when you eat a Tootsie Roll, all of you have eaten Tootsie Rolls, have invariably eaten paper before, because there's no way to ever truly get the wrapper off of there. So we've all eaten paper in our life. But again, if it's not food, laws of kashrut don't apply to it, and you could mix anything. So you could dip your paper in milk or meat juice or whatever you want like that. So if something loses its status as food because it's totally dried out, no problem. And by the way, that's what you do with gelatin. What you do is you totally dry out and desiccate the gelatin. However, if that's where gelatin ended, if you were to desiccate the gelatin and turn it into a totally dry powder, maybe you could rule based on this that I could take that dry gelatin powder and eat it, which would probably be disgusting and horrible, but that's not how gelatin is eaten. What do we do with the gelatin once we've dried it out and it's lost its status as food? We add it back into food. We add it back into food. And that's this next section. And Jane, I will call you in for this. And now we're actually getting into some contemporary rulings, because everyone is going to admit that once you have completely taken away all the moisture and you've totally desiccated, is the translation word they often use for it, the part of these unkosher animals, it's not food anymore. It's not a problem. But once you've turned it back into food again by rehydrating it, there's a debate. And that debate is kind of the key to what happens today. So the first one is I wouldn't say it's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, but what he does, Rabbi Eisenstadt, is he goes through almost all of the Shulchan Aruch in the 19th century, and he, on the page, brought almost every relevant ruling on that page, bringing it up hundreds of years like all filling in the gap of hundreds of years of different rulings on it. So it's an incredibly exciting, fun, and very important work that's on the page of the Shulchan Aruch. So you could say, fine, I see what he wrote in 1563. What's happened in the last 400 or 500 years? So go ahead, please, Jane, source number 1.
That was dried out. Look in the Teshuvah of Tiferet Tzvi, 1473, who writes that red worms that were dried used as ink, as dye for drinks. Look there to see that it is permitted.
So there was this very common practice. I don't actually remember when the Tiferet Tzvi was written, but before the Pitchei Teshuvah. And they had this thing. And by the way, if you look on the back of some products that have dyes in them, that don't have a kosher symbol on it, you'll see, or you can find out that they're made of animal dyes. So this practice has been going on for a long time. They had these dried worms, and they would dry them out and desiccate them to the point where they're not food anymore, and they would add them to these drinks to make them a certain color. And the Pitkei Tshuva brings in this, mentions a rabbi who permits it, the idea that once an unkosher food loses its status as food, even if you reintroduce it into food, which is exactly what we're talking about tonight. You've desiccated it, you've changed the chemical composition of it, it's no longer food by any stretch of the imagination, but now you're reintroducing it into food as an essential component to its color, texture, etc., like that. This source rules that it is fine. So if the Pirchei Shuva was the end of our conversation, then gummy bears with gelatin made from pig's feet, as long as everything else is kosher about it, would be great. But the Khatam Sofer, who's also contemporary 19th century, disagrees. So please, and Jane, you can take source number 2 as well.
I'm also thinking of the bugs that make red in drinks nowadays.
So that's what I'm saying. It's exactly the point, is that this is still a done practice
Kool-Aid,
today.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'll read. I am not able to find a permissive ruling because the skin was already dried out, and skin is a different case when it is still dehydrated, which is not our case when it becomes reconstituted by the liquid. And we rule as if it has again become actual meat. And this is obvious in my humble opinion.
And that's the counter to it. Someone mentioned that the bugs used for making dye are carmine beetles, which are probably not kosher. But the Khatam Sofer, who is a big, heavy hitter, says no. Once it becomes food again, it reverts to original thing. Fine. If it's not food and you're using it for something else, fine, that's not an issue. And if it's not food at all, like a dog wouldn't eat it and you happen to eat it, like eating a piece of paper, I don't know why you would, the Khatam Sofer might say, but if you're not eating food, it's not a problem. But once you make it food again, it regains its original stature. And by the way, there are principles like this in Jewish law. In the kitchen, if you use a pot to cook meat, and then you wait 24 hours and a minute, that pot is no longer a meat pot. Now, that's not the practice. Once we use a pot for meat, we leave it that way. But if I have a pot and I cook meat in it, and then I clean it out, it has to be clean, and then 24 hours and a minute later, I make a dairy soup in it, that is not treif. I have not treifed out my pot of the food unless I cook onions in it. Onions, which are considered a harif or sharp food, this is a whole other class, but I'm just bringing up that general principle, have the ability to revive the meat flavor in it. They can bring back a flavor, an essence that was gone, that was considered nullified and no longer significant. So the idea of something becoming no longer food, and we don't care about it, we don't treat it, we don't care about it for kashrut status anymore, but it coming back, that exists in Jewish law. So now you have two substantial rulings, one that says once it's no longer food, it can never become food again, and one that says once you reintroduce it and use it for food, it reattains its unkosher status. So one says pig feet, once it's gelatin, you're fine, put it in anything. And the other one says as soon as you put it in food, it becomes as if you're eating pig again. Now again, pig feet are still only forbidden rabbinically, but that's enough. So that's kind of the biggest, this is really where the machloket, where the debate comes from. These are the two sides. And again, we'll look at the end and see a summary of the rabbis and how they rule and some of their thinking. But this kind of gives you enough. You can rely on either of these. And in fact, many works say that while we generally don't eat gelatin derived from unkosher animals or kosher animals that are not slaughtered properly, you have something to rely on. You, as an observant Jew who keeps the laws of kashrut, could rely on source one. And that's why in Israel, there are the Rabbanut does permit some unkosher gelatins. So there's one more idea before we look at the final source summarizing the rabbinic opinions. Any questions up until now? Because we kind of have a lot of the tools, almost all the tools now, to be able to apply it to real world situations. Excellent. So I'm going to go full circle around. Lindsay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you again. This next one is fairly short, and it's also a relevant source that many rabbis use against gelatin. And it's a principle, again, you'll read it inside, but just to give you a sense of it is, when something is no longer a food, there are those who rule that once it's not a food, we don't care about it anymore, so gelatin is fine. But there's another principle, which is it doesn't really matter what happened to the thing, whether it turned into this substance or not. The only thing that can make something really not a food anymore is if you don't think of it as a food. And I know that sounds weird, and this source here is actually talking about marriage and taking oaths and stuff like that, but the end of it will be the really relevant source. So I'll explain it more when we get after it, but literally, if you think of gelatin as an ingredient that you include in food, it turns it into food again. So go ahead, Lindsay, here, please. If you want food, you got food. Source number 1.
Rav Mari said, we learn in the Mishnah as well that eating non-kosher food is considered eating, as if one said, it is konam for my wife to derive benefit from me if I ate today, and he had eaten carcasses or terafot, repugnant creatures or creeping animals, his wife is prohibited from deriving benefit from him.
By the way, the word konam there is a kind of oath. And again, there's different oaths about I'm going to do something, or an oath that if I do something, like in this case, this is where his wife comes in. If I do this thing, my wife can't get any benefit from me. She can't get food from me, money from me, etc., like that. But the question is, he's eating these, disgusting things. When I think about my favorite food, I don't think about crawling, disgusting creatures. But if he likes it, like chocolate-covered ants or something like that, and he considers it food, then it becomes food to him. So please continue on there, since he initially ate
the forbidden item, and only then took an oath saying that he did not eat. In taking the oath, he granted significance to the non-kosher food, and that is why his eating forbidden items is considered to be eating.
Excellent. So the Hebrew word there that they use is achshave. From the word chashuv, it gets this importance. It's considered as being food, which basically means that if gelatin really isn't food, then we don't have a problem. Again, paper. No one thinks of paper as food. There is actually, I believe, I forget the name for it. There is a condition of people who do actually eat that's like pick something like that, and animals might have it, where they will eat tiny things like pieces of paper. So I don't want to diminish that, but generally people don't see paper as food. Now, if we say that gelatin made from, pig feed, unkosher animals and stuff like that, well, it's not food, so therefore it's not an issue. But the reality is we treat gelatin as food, or the people who eat gelatin, because it's an essential ingredient that makes Jell-O and gummy bears and all these other things like that. So if you're eating it as food and you consider, like, again, people used to be more conscious of the fact that Jell-O was a gelatin snack. So if you consider it food, it doesn't matter how desiccated it becomes or returns the status of food. So the Khatam Sofer said because it's been rehydrated, it turns back into food. But this principle says it doesn't matter whether it's rehydrated or not. If you're eating it as food, and you're eating gelatin as food, and you think of it as food, then it becomes food. So those ideas become problematic, because if gelatin is not food, no problem. But as soon as we consider it to be food, then it's as if we're eating parts of an unkosher animal. So before we get into the final rulings, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, Pika. That's exactly what I was thinking of. Any questions before now? And now we have all of the principles. So we do have, and by the way, I didn't bring everything, but there are other rabbis. There's a work, Aruch HaShulchan, which is 20th century, who does permit the use of gelatin in certain. So there's plenty of rabbis on both sides. I didn't bring the complete list. Again, we'll see some of the big heavy hitters inside, but there are big deal rabbis that say gelatin is no longer food. And when it comes to this, if you consider it food, they reject that and say that doesn't apply here. We have plenty of reasons to permit it, etc. So there are people on both sides. So if somebody eats kosher gelatin in Israel from the Rabbanut, nobody could say you're eating treif. It is absolutely valid. However, at the same time, there are plenty of rabbis who say you probably shouldn't eat it. So any questions before we go on to our last source?
I have a question,
Yes, please.
or maybe it's a comment, but a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about community acceptance of a certain tradition or custom. And wouldn't that be fit in here? Because if you invite people over for Shabbat dinner and you've cooked something meat and now you're serving something milk from the same pan and people know about it, I mean, it puts them in an awkward position. So it seems like there would be kind of like a communal agreement about what's okay.
Absolutely. And I think that might be part of why there's this divide in America. Virtually in the Orthodox community, I don't believe there's any significant Orthodox rabbi who would permit gelatin from unkosher animals. In Israel, I think most don't, but the fact is many do permit it. So there's that kind of communal divide. And I don't remember exactly who said it, but when I was doing the research, there was one rabbi who brought the opinion that we should forbid it, not because of any of these permissive or forbidden sources we've seen, but merely as a matter of policy, partly because of what you just said, Elizabeth, is everybody having different about kosher and not kosher, it gets very confusing. And you can't just go into a kosher market and just buy gummy bears. If I go into Chicago and I go to Sarah's Tent, which is a lovely kosher market, I know that I could just close my eyes. I'd probably walk into a wall, but I could basically close my eyes and anything I pick off the shelves, I know is kosher by the standards of myself and my whole community. But when I went to Israel, that's why I started with that story. In Machane Yehuda, I have to look at the different hechshers. During Pesach, and again, there's nothing wrong with it. Sephardim eat kitniot, legumes, hummus, and stuff like that. And in the major markets, my Ashkenazi custom is not to do so. Now, first of all, there's nothing wrong with Sephardim. It's fully permitted according to their custom to eat hummus and things like that. And for Ashkenazim, we don't. So we respect and validate each other's customs. But when I go to a market in Israel on Pesach, I had to, they usually have a whole section saying, this section is for those who eat kitniot on Pesach. So they're helpful with that. But again, it does create some of those policy shifts and challenges. Now in Israel, I think they can bear it. And it's actually a beautiful thing, that diversity of customs. But here in the States, we like to be more, homogenous. That's a really great point, Elizabeth. So policy and communal practice are a big part of it. So this last section here, now that you guys saw all the different opinions about it being so desiccated, it loses the status of food, so it's not food anymore. What's your problem? And many rabbis for the last hundreds of years, whether it's through food dyes, I don't think they had Kool-Aid several hundred years ago, but whatever their Kool-Aid was, it was fine for them. And then some rabbis saying, yeah, it's desiccated, but once you turn it into food again, it becomes food again. And strictly speaking, though, based on the rulings of the Shulchan Aruch talking about the stomach and everything like that, it actually seems like the original earlier sources were more supportive. Like the foundational sources really would be okay with something like a gelatin. So the idea of it being reconstituted almost seemed like a bit more of a stretch. But again, you have opinions on both sides. So I've just brought this little section from the short article by Rav Daniel Schreiber, who just summarizes it in a very beautiful way, including a very practical ruling at the end that some of you might be wondering about. So he says, the main question revolves around whether the fact that pure gelatin is not fit to be eaten should be taken into account once it has been added to a food. That's exactly what I said. Once it's no longer food, do we care that it's now being used to make food? Should that change what it is? Should it be no different than I'm trying to triglycerides or whatever, all these millions of chemicals that you add for preserving foods? They're not food. They were never food. So they shouldn't affect kashrut as long as they're made in a factory and they don't have any unkosher ingredients. So they're not food. So that's not an issue if I put in this acid or whatever. But this gelatin was something unkosher at some point. Do we care about it now? So he's basically bringing the two most important opinions, and then I'll mention a third very important one. So Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinsky, 19th century Russian Empire, he's actually like Belarus, Lithuania, and he was one of the most important rabbis there. He was on the Beit Din, and in terms of relatively recent Jewish history and the most important rabbis who are making decisions, he's one of the, if you're going to do a top 10 list of the most important rabbis for Ashkenazi Jews, Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, is, in one of the top 3 or 4 spots without question. So he claimed that once it has the status of permitted, because it's not food anymore, it will not revert to being prohibited, even if it becomes edible again. And we saw all the sources that he could base it on, including the Pitchei Shuva, which he probably mentions as well. While it would appear that several authorities agreed with his claim, the Shach is a very important Siftei Kohen, a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, others disagree, the Chatam Sofer, and we saw that. We saw the Chatam Sofer that explicitly says, no, once you stick it back in food, it rehydrates and it becomes food again. But to rely on Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, that's okay. And in Israel, those who permit it, if you ask the Israeli Rabbanut, how can you permit gelatin in your gummies? They'll say, Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzinski. They won't do it with that accent, but that's what they'll say. That's their guy they rely on. Rav Moshe Feinstein, though, takes some way, he does not permit it, but in some ways it's kind of a middle stance. So Rav Moshe Feinstein argues that even if a non-edible substance which became edible again would remain permitted, like we rely on Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, gelatin is different. So he leaves room for the idea that there could be foods or ways to take tray foods and change it, if you could do it like a snap of a finger, I don't know what he's imagining, that it loses the status of food and is never food again. But specifically by gelatin, he argues that because all the stages are intermediate, it's always, well, I'll finish the sentence, within one process. The purpose of treating the gelatin is to produce a food in the end. And in such a case, an intermediate stage is not significant. This is kind of the idea I said earlier. If you're really making something panim charashot, brand new substance, why are you starting with pig feet? Why are you starting with the skin of unkosher animals? Because it's essential, and each time as you're changing it, you're basically making pig feet base. Even though you're doing all these chemical changes, it's really still fundamentally the same thing that's being changed a little bit at a time, and you're basically adding pig feet in as an ingredient. Yes, you're desiccating it and drying it out and making chemical changes, but at no point does it ever truly lose its status as pig feet. But again, I don't know what Rav Moshe would permit. I don't know what process could turn pig feet. And the reason I say pig feet is that is one of the most common ingredients used, other than unslaughtered cows. Those are the 2 most common things used in gelatin. So I don't know what he would imagine where it really would be okay. But the way gelatin is made, Rav Moshe says there could be a way to make kosher stuff from unkosher animals, but not the way they make gelatin. So you see how he's kind of hedging his bets is not the right thing, but he's outright forbidding gelatin, but he's not outright rejecting the principles. He was a very clever man. And the last one here, and it's very interesting, you see where he's from, Rav Aaron Kotler, who moved to the States, I believe after World War II, but he was also taught and raised in Belarus, in Lithuania. So he would have been, directly influenced. I'd have to look up more if he was a student of, and if he knew Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, but he's of that line, that lineage of students. So he added an argument that since and we've seen this idea, that since the purpose of gelatin is not to be eaten, but it is used as a coagulant, we saw the idea ma'amid, it's essential, like Jell-O wouldn't be Jell-O without some kind of gelatin. The principle of inedible foods being permitted should not apply to it. And we literally saw that exact thing with the 1 in 1,000. So we know his reasoning for this. Because it's an essential ingredient, you cannot pretend like it's not there. You can't say it's insignificant. You can't say we can forget that it's pig feet. It would not be gelatin without it having been this animal part. This is based on the fact that, and then he brings his metaphorical reasoning. This is based on the fact that yeast is prohibited on Pesach as a kind of chametz, even though yeast per se is inedible. Yeast is not an unkosher food, it's not chametz, and it can't be eaten. But what's it used for? The reason is that yeast is not a food in the sense that it is eaten, but only as a special ingredient in causing bread to rise. It has no purpose other than to create something which is forbidden on Pesach. Gelatin has no purpose other than to make the food, and therefore it can never truly leave the status of being a food ingredient. The same reasoning, Rav Kotler argued, should apply to gelatin. The reason I think it's important to bring this, even though it's just another voice forbidding it, is he brought this interesting idea that we just haven't seen before. For these reasons, In most localities, gelatin is not considered kosher. If one sees a product that claims to have kosher gelatin, this refers to the leniency of Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzinski. Theoretically, it is possible, of course, to produce gelatin from kosher animals, but this is apparently not practical. And he further in this article, he talks a little bit about that. Hypothetically, you could make gelatin from kosher slaughtered cows, but kosher meat is extremely expensive. And in fact, for most of these gelatins, they literally have these gelatin companies have their own killing fields where they're just slaughtering, not kosher, all the pigs and cows they need to make the gelatin. To have every one of them done by a shochet is just not practically possible. You could also make it, he mentions here a few years ago, work was started on producing gelatin from fish bones. This has not yet become commercially viable. Again, fish are much, much smaller, and it's much, it's not as easy to produce them, to kill them, et cetera, like as big animals like cows and pigs. But you can make a kosher gummy that will have the texture, which is what you really care about in the end, made with kosher fish. And again, it has to be kosher fish, like a salmon or tuna or something like that. It can't be made from, and we'll talk about in a few weeks, could you make it from a swordfish? That's an interesting question. There are also vegetable substitutes for gelatin, though less effective, such as agar-agar and seaweed. You can make it from seaweed. One of the interesting questions we're not going to really explore here is, what if you make gelatin, or you make gummy bears with fish gelatin? Now, fish gelatin being, has fish ingredients, there's a Jewish practice to not eat fish and meat. Could you eat those gummy bears and meat at the same time? And there are those who say be cautious, but many say it's so far removed from its status of fish that in that case, you do consider it nullified, and you could eat it with meat if you're going to have a hamburger with gummy bears on it. Again, if that's your thing. But again, that's not what gelatin is. Most products with gelatin are made from cows which are not kosher slaughtered, or from pigs. There may be other animals in there, but I don't think there's horse gelatin, but those are the two most common. In Israel, the Rabbanut, which is like the official government wing of rabbis that are over kashrut and weddings and stuff like that, gives a hechsher, it says it's kosher, to gelatin produced according to the instructions of Rab Chaim Ozer Grudzinski. It is usually marked in a manner indicating that it is based on a special kula. Kula is the word that means leniency. And by the way, and it's really important, leniency does not mean that it does not follow Jewish law. It's just a lenient opinion, but it's still a valid opinion. And that's so important. There are people who say, oh, you rely on a kula, on a leniency, therefore it's not kosher. That's not true. Being lenient does not mean it is not validly, it does not mean one is not observant. Mahadrin, which is like the highest, fanciest level supervision in Israel, as well as the national supervisions in the US, they do not authorize gelatin. So as Americans, our custom as Orthodox Jews is to not eat gelatin produced from, relying on this leniency. And just because we're in Israel, we're not going to change our custom. So when we went to those candy stores, we made sure that the candy was from a Mahadrin place for the gummy bears. But if our friend went with us and ate the gummy bears, I would not even think in my mind, it would never even arise in my mind that they're eating treif food. Now, if they went to the treif McDonald's and ate a cheeseburger, that's another story. I still wouldn't judge them because I'm not that kind of person, but that's so important. But again, it goes back to Elizabeth's question. If I go to a meal in Israel with an observant family, should I, and they put out gummy bears at the end of the meal, do I eat them or not eat them? Should I assume that they're giving me Mahadrim ones? And that can create some uncomfortable situations. Now, that is not a reason to not rely on this leniency, but it is something that should be taken into consideration. So that's it by food. Rav Moshe, even though he recognizes the principle and holds it up, he says gelatin, because it's so essential, it's a food product. Don't tell me it's not a food product, even though you can also use it for makeup and cosmetics. You're making it for making Jell-O. Therefore, it can never lose the status of food, and it's rabbinically forbidden. Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzinski says, look in the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Moshe Israelis talks about drying out a cow's stomach and putting milk and meat together, and it's fine. Obviously, once it's no longer food, end of story. And this rehydration thing, I'm not buying it. So you have two valid opinions, both with strong points on either side. But the last point here, which Jane actually mentioned when she was introducing the class on Shabbos, is what about medicine? What about gel caps, which are made from gelatin? And it's interesting, there's two parts to this here. So in his article, he writes it as, despite this, it is accepted that medicinal capsules, which are made of gelatin, are permitted if there's no non-gelatin equivalent. So my aunt and uncle actually own a health food store, and this is probably 10, 15 years ago, they got me kosher multivitamins that wouldn't have any cow products or anything like that. But the other side of this is not just, fine, the doctor says I have to take a pill for my health, and there's no way to get a kosher version of it. For medicine, I can be lenient because it's medicine. But the other side of it is, another reason to be lenient is medicine is not food. It's not food. You're not eating it as food. You don't eat it in the same way that you eat food, by swallowing it. So a chewable gummy multivitamin might be a problem. I would not eat it. I would not give it to my kids because it is eaten the way food is eaten. But any gel capsule, I would never see any problem with it whatsoever. Certainly if it's something that has to be taken. If it's a multivitamin that's swallowed, they don't do anything anyways. Sorry, Linus Pauling. But ultimately speaking, if somebody is sick and they need to swallow a pill, it doesn't matter what it's made of because A, it's medicine, and B, it's not food. But gelatin, again, you have parts on one side said it used to be food, it's not anymore. And it never really was food because people don't generally eat hooves, and it can never be food again. And the other side, who either Khatam Sofer says you rehydrated it so it became food again, or even though we don't care about this rehydration, it's being used to make food. So don't tell me that it's left the category of food. So whichever side you fall on, you have someone to rely upon. And Elizabeth's question might be one of the most important one, which is at the end of the day, you really go based on your community. And in the States, we often tend to, the Orthodox community often tends towards being stricter and to the right. Israel, it varies depending on, oftentimes on politics, but because Israel, they're much more confident and they have so many diverse Jews there, there's often a lot more space to be lenient and to have, hummus on Pesach and stuff like that, which is the beauty of Israel. But the most important takeaway from this is whether or not you're going to eat something that says it's kosher and has gelatin, is that we validate, respect, and recognize that both opinions are still kosher, whether or not you eat it.